Hi, everybody. I hope y'all are doing well. This is my elevator pitch. And today I'm going to be talking about social justice and environmental justice specifically. So environmental justice, the movement was started in the 1960s, paired with all of the other social justice movements that were happening at the time. Environmental justice was kind of a natural connection because it was this intersection of environmentalism and racism and classism and all of those things. So, people started to notice that there were places where there were toxic waste dumps that were either abandoned or unregulated, and that most of them happened to be in communities of color. And so that's kind of how the movement started, people trying to take action on that. And since then, it has grown and become a more popular idea. One group that made it quite popular was called the West Harlem Environmental Action Group, which started in 1990. And they were kind of one of the leaders in defining environmental justice and setting the example for the rest of the United States. But of course, movements towards environmental justice have been going on for much longer than that. That's just the history of when the term was coined. So that is kind of just a brief history and a definition of what environmental justice is. It aims to address the correlation between environmental degradation and communities of color and other oppressed groups of people, like low-income communities. And it intersects with so many different things, like, for example, the history of unions and the coal mining history. All of that stuff is connected to environmental justice because people are advocating for their own personal health, for their workers' rights, and also for having a healthy living environment. So all these things tend to be very tied together. We have a lot of local issues that are connected to that. And probably here in Denver, the most common one is the issue of Suncor. And Suncor is a power plant that exists in Commerce City, which is the northern part of Denver. And they, in 2018, had over 1,000 times that they broke the law for producing an illegal amount of toxic chemicals. They're called forever chemicals, like hydrogen cyanide, that go into the air and into Sand Creek, into the soil and into the water. So they have been sued various times by groups, including 350 Colorado. And there have been various groups that have tried to stop them. But right now, the way that it is that every time they break a law, they just have to pay a fine. And the company is a Canadian oil company. They are specifically processing really crude oil, which is part of what makes the Suncor refinery in Commerce City particularly environmentally poor. And that neighborhood is 80% Latino. So it's largely a community of color. And one of the huge arguments for keeping Suncor is that people say that it's providing jobs for that community. So that's part of what their argument has been, to be able to continue to stay open. This year, Suncor received a huge fine that they had to pay. It's like $9 billion that they had to pay because of all of the environmental catastrophes that they've caused. There's even been days where kids have to be sent home from school, days where there's yellow ash raining down and people have to turn on their windshield wipers to drive through the city because of the level of toxins that are in the air. So they have to pay this $9 billion fine, right? And there's a committee that was formed to decide who gets how the fine will be used. And one of the agreements was that members of Suncor would be on the committee. So even though they're paying these fines, they get to decide how the fines are used. And one example of that is that they have a Boys and Girls Club that's called the Suncor Boys and Girls Club. So they're effectively using their fine money in certain moments to actually promote their organization. So the Suncor refinery is the reason why 80216 is the most polluted zip code in the entire country of the United States of America. And it's just right here in North Denver. And most people who live in Denver have not heard of it at all. They've never even heard the term Suncor. So it's something that people still largely don't know very much about it. And that's why I chose this topic to discuss, because I think it's really important to spread awareness about it. And the best organization that's doing work on it is 350 Colorado, and they're doing a lot of grassroots community organizing that's being led by the Commerce City community. But that's actually one of my critiques as well of environmental justice, is that it tends to be hyper localized. And so a lot of the movements that happen are making the argument that it's specifically the community that lives in that spot that is affected. And so it's hard to garner support from people who live in other communities nearby. And so I think, especially with the Suncor thing and with other various environmental justice issues, if we can garner the support of the white communities that are in the surrounding area and help them understand that they too are also affected, I think that that could actually help the movement a lot. Like, for example, people in Cherry Creek are still breathing in the toxins that Suncor is producing. It's certainly not as bad as what's happening in Commerce City, but there's a lot of money in Cherry Creek that could back this movement. So I think it would be smart to take advantage of it. I'll also say that even going beyond a national scale of getting other people involved, I think it would be beneficial for this movement to be more open to people on the other side of our border. People in the United States, in my opinion, tend to be very isolated, and we don't always think about the rest of the world and other countries. And a lot of the environmental injustices that happen through the United States actually don't take place on our land. And one example of that is the Coca-Cola factories that I've experienced in Honduras, in the country of Honduras, in San Pedro Sula. There is a Coca-Cola factory that has taken a lot of the water from local tribal communities and used that to make Coca-Cola. And they also have very unhealthy living situation for the people working in the Coca-Cola factory. And we in the United States are the people who are actually paying for that, right? Because we're the people who are buying that Coke, those bottles of Coke. But we don't see it, we don't have to think about it, and we don't consider it. So when we think about environmental justice, we need to think about the people that are in other countries on the other side of our border that are getting cancer a lot of times and getting serious, toxic toxins going into their bodies, so that we can consume products for cheap. So that's another one of my criticisms of the environmental justice movement so far, is that it's segregated in that it only includes Americans a lot of the time, and also, just as a caveat, I'm not saying that there's not also problems here that we need to take care of. There's a lot of environmental justice work that needs to happen right here in the United States. Another great example of this stuff historically is the work that Dolores Huerta did with the whole protests that were happening in California for the grape pickers and the farmers. That's largely considered to be a workers' rights issue, but actually they did a lot of environmental justice stuff. And they looked a lot at the chemicals that were being sprayed on the grapes and that the impact that was having on the farmers. So just another example of the intersectionality of this issue. So my call to action for this is to donate to 350 Colorado. It is a nonprofit organization that is basically a watchdog for Suncor, and they do a lot of work on that. They have even tried to sue them in the past, and they do a lot of community organizing. Really, really great work. And my second call to action is to not buy Coca-Cola products, because even though they might taste good, they cause a lot of harm to people in Honduras and in India and around the world. So thanks a lot for listening. Have a great night.